Revenge is not a fire that burns hot and dies quickly. True revenge is ice, patient, calculating, inevitable. It waits for decades if necessary, watches from the shadows, and strikes only when the target has forgotten to fear it. Melissa learned this in the crimson heart of the Crimson Citadel, under the weight of 1,000 iron sconces that dripped shadows like spilled ink. She had stood before him, Eddie, the vampire king of eternal cruelty, and promised him the only true thing she had left, his destruction. And he had laughed. It began on the night of the blood tithe, an execution that stained the courtyard stones darker with each passing century. The air, usually cold with the scent of old blood and older magic, was thick with the presence of immortals, a suffocating mixture of power and boredom, and the sharper, electric taste of mortal fear that rose from the crowd like steam. The condemned knelt on black marble worn smooth by generations of the doomed, and gargoyles with ruby eyes watched from every column, their stone mouths frozen in eternal mockery. Thomas, Melissa's grandson, was dragged forward in chains that sang against the stone. He was young, barely 23, his hands calloused from honest work in the mortal quarter. A scribe, a keeper of records, his fingers more accustomed to ink and parchment than the cold iron that now bound him. But tonight he wore the gray robes of the accused, a borrowed shame stitched into every seam. Wait. Before the story gets even crazier, smash that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what part of the story has you locked in. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. The charges were treason. A lie. Lord Corvus, seeking to eliminate a rival family, had planted forged documents in Thomas's quarters, correspondence with rebels who sought to overthrow the vampire court. It was efficient, brutal, and entirely legal by Eddie's laws. Thomas protested his innocence, his voice breaking against the indifferent stone. But Eddie, seated on his obsidian throne like a carved idol of beautiful apathy, waved away the defense with one elegant hand. For 400 years, Eddie had ruled. Not with bombast or theatrical cruelty, though he was capable of both. His power was in his absolute authority. He could end lives with a gesture, topple dynasties with a single softly spoken decree. He moved through his court with the grace of a predator so apex, so utterly secure, that he no longer bothered to bare his fangs. Melissa had watched him for decades. She saw the king others feared, the immortal predator, the political architect who played chess with kingdoms. But she also saw what he'd become, a creature so comfortable in his power that mortal lives were nothing more than background noise. Less than noise. Silence. She had served his court for 37 years as master herbalist, grinding the compounds that kept his courtiers strong, brewing the blood tonics that prevented decay. She had read his history in the royal archives while preparing poisons for his enemies. The wars, the purges, the casual executions of mortals who dared speak above their station. And in her quiet, methodical heart, a cold, terrible thing had taken root. Tonight, the execution was swift. Thomas's final words, "Grandmother, I'm innocent," cut off by the headsman's blade. The sound echoed once, final and irreversible, then was swallowed by the stone and the satisfied murmurs of the courtiers who'd gathered to watch. Melissa did not scream, did not weep. She stood in the crowd of mortals, her spine bent with age, her gray hair like iron wire pulled back from a face carved by grief and years. Her hands, gnarled from decades of grinding poisons and brewing remedies, clenched at her sides. But her eyes burned with something the immortals in their comfortable cruelty had forgotten to recognize. Purpose. 3 days later, she demanded an audience with the king. The throne room was a cathedral to excess and shadow. Vaulted ceilings disappeared into darkness above, and every surface gleamed with polished obsidian and veins of silver that looked like frozen lightning. Eddie sat on his throne as he always did, relaxed, beautiful, utterly bored. His silver-white hair fell in perfect waves past his shoulders. His face was the kind of beautiful that had been honed by centuries, sharp cheekbones, a mouth that could be cruel or sensual depending on his whim, and eyes the color of old amber that had watched empires crumble. Around him, his court. Lord Corvus, the architect of Thomas's death, stood near the throne with a goblet of blood wine, his expression one of satisfied superiority. Lady Seraphine, ancient and exquisite, lounged on his chaise with the languid posture of someone who'd perfected boredom 300 years ago. Lesser vampires lined the walls, their attention only half on the proceedings. Some mortal petitioner was always seeking justice, mercy, coin. Melissa walked forward. Her footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, small, insignificant sounds. She wore widow's black, the same dress she'd worn to her husband's funeral 40 years ago, now faded and patched. She was a creature of gray and shadow in a world of jewel tones and immortal beauty. She stopped at the base of the throne steps, bowed once formally with the precision of someone who'd served this court long enough to know its rituals. Then she lifted her head and spoke. "I stand before you, King Eddie, to make you a promise." Her voice was steady, roughened by age, but carrying clearly through the throne room. "You executed my grandson, Thomas, on false charges. You did not investigate. You did not care. You ended his life as thoughtlessly as you'd snuff a candle." A ripple of interest moved through the court. Eddie's amber eyes focused on her with the lazy attention of a cat noticing a mouse. "And for this," Melissa continued, her gnarled hands folded before her, "I will destroy you." Silence. Then, Eddie laughed. It was a rich, warm sound, genuine amusement rolling through the throne room like honey. His courtiers joined in, a chorus of delighted mockery. Lord Corvus's laugh was especially loud, vindicated. Lady Seraphine covered her mouth with one pale hand, her shoulders shaking with elegant mirth. The sound echoed off the obsidian walls, multiplying, surrounding Melissa like a physical force. An old woman bent, gray, powerless, threatening the most powerful vampire in existence. It was absurd. Delicious. The best entertainment they'd had in weeks. Eddie leaned forward on his throne, his smile showing just the hint of fong. "You," he said, his voice smooth as silk over steel. "You will destroy me? Grandmother, go home. Grieve your blood. But do not waste my time with threats you cannot possibly keep." Melissa did not flinch, did not weep, did not rage. She simply bowed again, deeper this time, a gesture that could have been respect or mockery, and turned to walk out. But Eddie saw it. Just for a moment, as she turned, he caught the look in her eyes. Ancient. Cold. Utterly, terrifyingly certain. Chapter 1. The laughter followed Melissa home. She heard it in the cobblestone streets of the Mortal Quarter, where oil lamps flickered behind rain-streaked windows and the smell of cooking fires couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of fear that permeated every corner of Eddie's domain. She heard it in the creak of her cottage door, in the settling of old wood, in the silence that filled the spaces where Thomas's voice should have been. Her cottage was small, 2 rooms and a workroom, tucked between a chandler's shop and a boarding house for mortal servants who worked in the citadel. She'd lived here for 43 years, ever since her husband died and left her with nothing but her knowledge and her skill. The front room held a narrow bed, a table, 2 chairs. One for her. One that would stay empty now forever. She didn't sit in either. Instead, Melissa walked directly to the workroom at the back, a cramped space that smelled of dried herbs, copper, and something sharper. Sulfur. Nightshade extract. The metallic tang of preserved blood samples in sealed vials. Her workbench dominated the room, its surface scarred by decades of grinding, mixing, calculating. Above it, shelves sagged under the weight of journals, ledgers, specimen jars labeled in her precise handwriting. Hold up. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a chapter. Hit like and comment your country or city and what you're enjoying most about the story so far. I'm reading every single one. Grief rose in her throat like bile. Thomas had sat at this bench just last month, carefully transcribing her notes on vampire coagulation properties, his young face serious with concentration. "Why do you keep all this, grandmother?" he'd asked. "You're retired. Knowledge," she'd told him, "is the only thing they can't take from you." She'd been wrong. They'd taken him. And with him, they'd taken the last soft thing in her heart. Melissa's hands shook as she lit the oil lamp, but she forced them steady. Steadiness was required now. Precision. She pulled her oldest journal from the shelf, leather-bound, its pages yellowed with age. 40 years of observations. Vampire physiology. Blood chemistry. Weaknesses carefully catalogued and disguised as medicinal notes. She opened to a blank page and wrote in the measured script she'd perfected over decades. Day 1. The king laughed. "I have made my vow." The grief tried to surface again, tried to crack her open and spill out in sobs and screams. But Melissa had learned long ago how to transform pain into something colder. Something useful. She breathed slowly, deliberately, feeling the grief crystallize in her chest. Ice replacing fire. Calculation replacing rage. She would not kill Eddie. That was the realization that settled over her with absolute clarity. Death was too quick, too merciful, too much like sleep for a creature who'd lived 400 years and grown comfortable in his immortality. Death would make him a martyr. Death would teach him nothing. No. She would educate him. She would show him what it meant to lose everything while still breathing. To watch his carefully built empire crumble. To feel the cold terror of powerlessness. To understand, finally, that mortal lives like Thomas's, mattered in ways his ancient, arrogant soul had forgotten. Melissa pulled down another journal, this one filled with court records, political alliances, trade agreements she'd copied over the years. Then another, vampire hierarchies, feuds, old grudges buried, but never forgotten. She spread them across the workbench like a general planning a campaign. Because that's what this was. A war. A long, patient, invisible war. She had time. All the time grief and rage could buy. She was 71 years old, her body bent and her hands gnarled, but her mind was sharp as the day she'd first ground wolfsbane for the court physician. And she had something Eddie's courtiers, with all their immortal beauty and power, lacked. She had nothing left to lose. Melissa reached for a specimen jar labeled Thornvale Extract, unstable. She'd developed it years ago, a compound that interacted poorly with vampire telepathy, causing mild hallucinations. She discarded it as too unpredictable for medical use. But for revenge? Perfect. She opened her journal to a fresh page and began to write. Not with the shaking hand of a grieving grandmother, but with the steady precision of a master herbalist who'd spent 37 years learning every secret the Citadel tried to hide. Target 1, blood supply. Compound, Thornvale. Delivery method, cattle stock, Southern Holdings. Timeline, 3 weeks for saturation. Expected result, weakened telepathic bonds, mild paranoia, foundation destabilization. Outside, rain began to fall. The mortal quarter settled into its uneasy night, where windows were barred and prayers were whispered to gods who no longer listened. Inside, Melissa worked. The king had laughed at her threat. She would make him remember that laughter. Would make him taste it, bitter and metallic as everything he'd built turned to ash in his elegant hands. Revenge, she'd learned, was not hot. It was ice. Patient. Inevitable. And winter had only just begun. Chapter 2. The weeks that followed were measured in careful, methodical movements. Melissa became a creature of ritual and precision, rising before dawn to tend her distillations, working through the night by lamplight while the mortal quarter slept uneasily above her. Her workbench transformed into something that would have terrified the court, had they bothered to look. Glass vials lined the shelves in careful rows, each one labeled in code only she could read. Thorvale extract in varying concentrations. Silverleaf tincture that wouldn't burn vampire flesh, but would disrupt their enhanced senses. Bloodbane, a compound so subtle it wouldn't trigger their immortal immune systems, just weaken them incrementally, making them vulnerable to things they'd forgotten to fear. She wasn't brewing poisons to kill. Death was crude, obvious, easily traced. These were instruments of erosion. Weapons designed to make the invulnerable feel mortal again. In the corner of her workroom, wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath loose floorboards, were the court seals. She'd kept them when she retired, a oversight by Lord Corvus's predecessor, who'd never bothered to inventory what a mere herbalist might possess. The Keeper of Cattle seal. The Trade Warden seal. The Bloodstock Authority seal. Each one capable of authorizing documents, shipments, changes to supply chains. Each one a key to Eddie's carefully controlled empire. Melissa spent 3 days forging requisition orders, her hand steady despite her age. The paper she used was authentic, stolen from the Citadel archives years ago, aged perfectly. The ink was period correct, mixed from her own recipes. The handwriting belonged to clerks long dead, styles she'd studied and could now reproduce with unsettling accuracy. When she was finished, she had authorization to supplement the southern cattle holdings with stock from the Thormere Valley, a region known for rich grazing that produced particularly flavorful blood. The documents were flawless. They would pass every inspection because she'd written half the inspection protocols herself, 30 years ago. But more important than the poisons and the forgeries was the map. She'd covered an entire wall with it, a spiderweb of connections drawn in charcoal and ink. Eddie sat at the center, a black sun around which everything orbited. Radiating outward were the names, the alliances, the feuds. Lord Corvus, ambitious and cruel, held the king's favor, but was envied by Lady Seraphine. Lady Seraphine controlled the blood trade, but had ancient grievances with Elder Marcellus. Elder Marcellus advised Eddie on treaties, but secretly despised the werewolf alliance that kept the southern border stable. Every vampire in that court had ambitions, resentments, weaknesses. Melissa studied the web like a scholar reading scripture. She marked the pressure points, the places where a single push might cause ripples, where trust was thinnest, where paranoia could bloom like poison nightshade in fertile soil. The blood supply was the obvious first strike. Every vampire in the Citadel depended on it, from the lowest courtier to Eddie himself. It was centralized, controlled, and utterly trusted, which made it perfect. On the 23rd day, Melissa packed a small leather satchel with vials of Thornvale extract, wrapped carefully in cloth. She dressed in the drab clothing of the mortal quarter, a washerwoman or a servant, forgettable and beneath notice. She tucked the forged requisition documents into her bodice, where they lay against her heart like a promise. The journey to the southern cattle holdings took 2 days by hired cart. She told the driver she was visiting a cousin, and he didn't ask questions. Mortals in Eddie's domain had learned not to. The holdings were vast fields of cattle bred specifically for vampire consumption, their blood rich and carefully monitored. The overseer was a mortal named Greaves, a tired man who'd held the position for 15 years and had learned to do exactly what the requisition orders told him without question. Melissa presented her documents. Greaves barely glanced at them before nodding, already moving to show her the new stock from Thormere Valley. That night, while the cattle lowed softly in their pens and the overseer slept in his cottage, Melissa moved among them like a ghost. She administered the Thornvale through their feed, precise doses, calculated to saturate their blood over the course of 3 weeks without causing visible symptoms in the animals themselves. The vampires wouldn't taste it, wouldn't see it, wouldn't know until the damage was already spreading through their telepathic networks like frost across glass. When she was finished, Melissa stood at the edge of the field and looked back toward the distant lights of the Crimson Citadel, black spires cutting against the stars. "I am coming for you," she whispered to the night. "Slowly. Inevitably. And you will never see me until it's too late." The cattle continued their peaceful grazing, unaware they carried the first weapon in a war the Vampire King didn't yet know he'd already lost. Melissa returned to her cottage, crossed the first item off her list, and began preparing the second strike. Winter was spreading. Chapter 3. The first reports came to Eddie like whispers through cracked glass, distorted, uncertain, easy to dismiss. Lord Corvus was the first to mention it during evening council, his usual arrogance slightly frayed at the edges. "Your Majesty, I've been experiencing irregularities in the telepathic bond. Yesterday I could have sworn I sensed Lord Hadrian plotting in the West Wing, but when I investigated, he was in the library. Reading." Eddie barely glanced up from the treaty documents before him. "You're becoming paranoid in your old age, Corvus. Perhaps you should feed more regularly." But Corvus wasn't alone. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, tap subscribe and drop a like. Then tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what moment grabbed you the most. Your comments help keep the story alive. Lady Seraphine complained of shadows in her peripheral vision, figures that disappeared when she turned her head. Lord Hadrian reported difficulty maintaining his mental shields, something he hadn't struggled with since he was a fledgling 3 centuries ago. Even the lesser courtiers whispered among themselves, trading stories of strange dreams, fractured thoughts, moments of confusion that vanished as quickly as they appeared. Nothing severe. Nothing obvious. Just enough to make the ancient stones of the citadel feel subtly wrong, like a familiar song played slightly off-key. The Elder's representative, a vampire named Tertius who'd survived since the fall of Rome, arrived for his quarterly inspection with his usual detached professionalism. He sampled the blood reserves, tested the court's telepathic network, reviewed the security protocols. Everything passed. Everything was within acceptable parameters. But as he prepared to leave, he paused in the throne room doorway. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "there are disruptions. Minor fluctuations in the blood quality. Nothing that violates health standards, but unusual nonetheless. The Elders would recommend investigating your supply chain. As a precaution." Eddie waved a dismissive hand. "The Southern Holdings recently integrated new stock from Thornmere. Superior grazing, richer blood. The adjustment period is causing minor inconsistencies. It will stabilize." Tertius bowed, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "Of course, Your Majesty. But the Elders do appreciate vigilance." After he left, Eddie found himself standing on his private balcony, looking out over the mortal quarter. The unease his courtiers reported was beginning to infect him as well, though he'd never admit it. His connection to his inner circle felt muffled, like trying to hear through thick cloth. Nothing was broken, exactly. Just dulled. Imprecise. Temporary contamination, he told himself. The blood would adjust. His court would settle. Everything would return to its perfect, controlled order. It had to. In her cottage, Melissa sat at her workbench with a journal open before her, documenting each report with meticulous care. She had her sources, mortal servants who worked in the Citadel, who overheard things and reported back for the silver coins she paid them. Gossip flowed through the mortal quarter like water, and she'd learned decades ago how to collect it. Day 47. Telepathic disruptions confirmed. Corvus experiencing paranoia. Seraphine reports visual disturbances. Elder representative noted blood quality concerns, but found no violations. The Thorn Veil is working as calculated. She allowed herself a small, cold smile. The first tremor had registered. Not enough to cause alarm, but enough to plant seeds of doubt. Enough to make them question the one thing they'd always taken for granted, their absolute control. That night, she prepared her next message. The white lily was perfect, hothouse grown, its petals pristine and pale as bone. In her youth, when she'd still tended the sick and dying at the Citadel, She'd left these flowers at the bedsides of those in her care. A symbol of peace, of mourning, of endings. Eddie wouldn't remember. He'd never noticed what a mortal herbalist left for other mortals. But she would remind him slowly until the symbolism became impossible to ignore. She wrapped the lily in plain cloth and paid a courier, a different one each time, always paid in advance, never asked questions, to deliver it to the citadel with instructions to leave it at the king's private chambers. No note, no signature, just the flower. The courier returned the next day with confirmation. The lily had been delivered and received. Melissa crossed another item off her list and moved to the wall map, studying the web of connections with the eye of a general surveying a battlefield. The Thornvale would continue working for another month, building paranoia, fracturing trust. But it was time to add pressure from a different angle. The Werewolf Alliance. The Treaty of Iron Shadows. 30 years of carefully maintained peace that kept Eddie's southern border secure. She pulled down a different journal, this one filled with diplomatic protocols, negotiation records, old grievances between species that had never quite been resolved. Finding the weak point took her less than an hour. In the citadel, Eddie stood in his chambers, staring at the white lily someone had left on his desk. He didn't recognize it as significant. Didn't remember the old herbalist who'd once left these for the dying. He simply moved it aside, returned to his correspondence, and forgot about it entirely. For now. But in the mortal quarter, Melissa was already writing the forged documents that would shatter his alliance and leave his kingdom vulnerable. The tremor was only the beginning. The earthquake was still to come. Chapter 4. The messenger arrived at the Crimson Citadel at dawn, when the vampires were drowsy with approaching daylight and the mortal servants were beginning their endless tasks. He was werewolf, massive, scarred, and carrying the scent of pine forests and barely controlled rage. He demanded immediate audience with the king. Eddie received him in the small council chamber, a concession that already spoke volumes. Kings did not rearrange their schedules for messengers. But the Treaty of Iron Shadows was the cornerstone of his southern defense, negotiated over decades, sealed with blood oaths that even immortals respected. The messenger threw a leather document case onto the council table with enough force to crack the ancient wood. "The Alpha sends his regards," the werewolf said, his voice a growl that made the air vibrate. "And his declaration. The treaty is void. The clans declare neutrality. As of this moment, your southern border is your own problem." Eddie went very still, the kind of stillness that preceded violence. Lord Corvus, standing at his right hand, stepped forward with political smoothness. "There must be some misunderstanding. Our last negotiations were entirely misunderstanding." The werewolf's laugh was harsh. "Your ambassador called the Alpha's bloodline mongrel spawn fit only for hunting rats in mortal gutters. That's not a misunderstanding. That's an insult that demands blood." The chamber erupted. Lady Seraphine's hand flew to her throat in theatrical shock. Elder Marcellus leaned forward, his ancient face carved with concern. Lord Corvus's expression flickered between confusion and defensive outrage. Eddie raised one hand, and silence fell like a blade. "I approved those negotiations personally," he said, his voice soft and deadly. "Ambassador Thorn would never." Then perhaps, the werewolf interrupted, "you should read what Ambassador Thorn actually wrote." He pulled a letter from the case, expensive parchment, sealed with Eddie's own diplomatic seal, written in what appeared to be Thorn's precise handwriting. Eddie took it, his amber eyes scanning the contents. With each line, his expression grew colder. The letter was a masterpiece of calculated insult. It began with proper diplomatic courtesy, then devolved into barely veiled contempt. References to beast clans and savage nobility. Suggestions that the werewolves should be grateful for vampire tolerance. And there, in the final paragraph, the phrase that had detonated the alliance, "mongrel spawn fit only for hunting rats in mortal gutters." It was perfect. Too perfect. The seal was authentic, the handwriting flawless, the paper correct. But Eddie had read Thorne's reports himself, had approved language that was respectful if formal. This was not what he'd authorized. "I will speak with Ambassador Thorne," Eddie said carefully. "This will be rectified." Ambassador Thorne, the werewolf said with savage satisfaction, was found dead this morning. "Suicide, they're saying. Throat cut in his own quarters. Convenient, isn't it?" The council chamber went silent. Eddie's hand tightened on the letter, his knuckles white. "The Alpha gives you 30 days to withdraw all forces from the disputed borderlands," the messenger continued. "After that, the treaty's protection is void. Good luck with your enemies, Vampire King. You're going to need it." He turned and walked out, leaving the stink of wolf and the weight of disaster behind him. Eddie stared at the letter, his mind racing. Thorne had been loyal for 70 years. The seal was perfect, but seals could be stolen. The handwriting was exact, but skillful forgers existed. The paper, the ink, the phrasing that mimicked Thorne's formal style while twisting it into poison. Someone had done this. Someone with intimate knowledge of court protocol, access to diplomatic materials, and the skill to forge documents that could fool even him. "Find out who did this," he said quietly. "I want every document Thorne wrote in the last year examined. Every seal, every piece of correspondence. Someone has betrayed this court, and I will know their name." Lord Corvus bowed and hurried out, but Eddie saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Lady Seraphine exchanged glances with Elder Marcellus, and there, just for a moment, Eddie saw something he hadn't seen in his court in decades. Fear. Not of him, but of something else. Something invisible. Something that could strike at the heart of his power and vanish like smoke. Eddie looked down at the forged letter again, his amber eyes catching on the small, perfect details that made it so convincing. Professional work. Expert work. Work that reminded him, suddenly, of the old herbalist who'd kept such meticulous records. Who'd documented everything, saved everything, cataloged every detail of court life for 37 years. The herbalist whose grandson he'd executed 5 weeks ago. No. Impossible. She was an old woman, grief-stricken, powerless. She couldn't possibly. But the thought lodged in his mind like a splinter. Small. Sharp. Impossible to ignore. In her cottage, Melissa sat at her workbench and crossed another item off her list. Treaty of Iron Shadows, destroyed. She picked up her pen and wrote the next target. The Bloodstock Merchant. The one who kept Eddie's private reserve pure and uncontaminated. He wouldn't be pure for much longer. Chapter 5. The Blood Merchant was discovered 3 days after the treaty collapsed, hanging from the rafters of his warehouse in the Mortal Quarter. Suicide, the guards declared, pointing to the chair kicked over beneath his swaying feet. But the ledgers they found told a different story. Pages and pages of falsified records. Dilution ratios. Cheap cattle blood mixed with the premium stock. Years of fraud, meticulously documented in the merchant's own handwriting, or what appeared to be his handwriting. The evidence was damning, irrefutable, and perfectly calculated to suggest that Eddie's blood supply had been compromised for months. Lord Corvus brought the ledgers to Eddie personally, his face grave. "Every noble in the Citadel has been drinking diluted blood," he said. "Weakened. Made vulnerable. If word reaches the elders." "It won't," Eddie interrupted, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. He flipped through the ledgers, his amber eyes scanning the entries. The work was thorough, professional. Too professional for a merchant who'd been content to skim profits for decades. This was a plant. Had to be. But proving it would take time they didn't have. "Burn the body," Eddie ordered. "Confiscate the warehouse. Tell the nobles it was an isolated incident, now corrected." But the lie tasted bitter even as he spoke it. The next disaster arrived 5 days later, dressed in elders' robes and ancient authority. Elder Thaddeus of the High Council had come to inspect the Citadel's stability, a diplomatic gesture that was really an investigation into the treaty collapse and the growing rumors of internal corruption. Eddie received him with full ceremony, offering his finest hospitality, including a private reserve of blood aged for a century, reserved for honored guests. They'd barely finished the second course when Elder Thaddeus collapsed. The convulsions were violent, immediate, and horrifying. An elder, one of the ancients who'd survived plague, war, and assassination attempts for 800 years, writhing on the floor of Eddie's dining hall, his ancient blood rejecting something it couldn't process. The court physician worked frantically, but the compound Melissa had introduced was designed specifically for this. It reacted only with blood aged beyond 6 centuries, a cocktail of silver-touched nightshade and processed wolfsbane that wouldn't kill, but would incapacitate spectacularly. Elder Thaddeus survived, barely, but the message was sent. Not even Eddie's private reserve was safe. Paranoia bloomed like mold in dark corners. Don't skip. Hit like, subscribe, and comment your location plus favorite moment so far. Let's see how far this story has reached. Courtiers began traveling with food tasters. Lady Seraphine refused all drink not poured from sealed bottles she personally inspected. Lord Corvus stationed guards outside his chambers and slept with silver daggers beneath his pillow. The telepathic bonds, already weakened by Thornvale, frayed further under the weight of suspicion. Eddie began his own investigation. Interrogations. Searches. He tore through his court like a predator hunting a viper in his nest, but every lead dissolved into confusion. The blood merchant's record seemed genuine. The elder's poisoning had no source. The bottle was tested, found clean, yet somehow contaminated. The forged treaty letter remained unexplained despite 70 interviews. Someone was betraying him. Someone close, with access, with knowledge, with skill. Eddie assembled his inner circle in his private study, the room where he made his most ruthless decisions. The faces around him, Lord Corvus, Lady Seraphine, Elder Marcellus, his personal guard captain, were familiar, trusted, essential. And one of them, he was certain, was the architect of his unraveling. No one leaves the Citadel without my permission, he declared. All correspondence will be monitored. All movements tracked. Until I find the traitor, we trust no one. The meeting ended in tense silence, and when Eddie returned to his chambers that night, he found it waiting on his pillow. A single white lily. Perfect, pristine, its petals already beginning to brown at the edges. A funeral flower. And beneath it, the faintest scent of herbs, rosemary, thyme, something medicinal and old. Memory struck him like a physical blow. The herbalist. The old woman in widow's black who'd stood before his throne 7 weeks ago and promised his destruction. The one who'd left lilies at bedsides. The one with 37 years of access to seals, documents, protocols. The one with knowledge of poisons, blood alchemy, vampire physiology. The one whose grandson he'd laughed about executing. Find Melissa, Eddie ordered the guards, his voice raw. The herbalist. Bring her to me. Now. They returned at dawn with news that made his blood run cold. The cottage was empty. Not recently abandoned, carefully, methodically cleared out weeks ago. The workroom had been stripped bare. The journals, the samples, the decades of accumulated knowledge gone. Only dust and the lingering scent of herbs remained. Melissa had vanished into the mortal quarter like smoke, and Eddie realized with dawning horror that he'd been searching for a traitor in his inner circle while the true enemy had been a ghost all along. A ghost who'd been systematically dismantling his empire for 2 months, while he dismissed her as powerless, irrelevant, beneath notice. Eddie stood in the empty cottage, holding the white lily, and felt something he hadn't experienced in 400 years. Fear. Chapter 6. Melissa lived in the bones of the Citadel now. The tunnels were older than Eddie's reign, carved by mortal slaves 3 centuries ago when the fortress was first built. Service passages that allowed servants to move unseen, delivering meals and removing waste without disturbing their immortal masters. Forgotten spaces that had been mapped in the archives, but never walked by anyone who mattered. She knew them all. had walked them for 37 years, carrying her herbs and remedies, learning every secret turn, every hidden door, every place where sound carried and walls were thin. Now she lived like a rat in those walls, and the comparison didn't bother her in the slightest. Her new home was a storage chamber 3 levels below the kitchens, once used for preserving meat, now abandoned and sealed behind a door the servants avoided because they said it smelled of death. Melissa had cleaned it, lined the walls with stolen blankets, and arranged her remaining vials and journals by lamplight that never reached the world above. From here, she could move anywhere. The passages connected to the noble quarters, the blood cellars, the council chambers. She could slip through walls like a ghost, do her work, and vanish before anyone knew she'd been there. And her work was accelerating. 3 nights ago, she'd poisoned Lord Corvus's private stock with a compound that intensified the thorn veil already in his system. Not enough to harm him, but enough to make the shadows move wrong, to make whispered conversations sound like plotting, to turn his natural paranoia into something sharper and more dangerous. Last night, she'd stood in the servant passage outside his chambers and listened to him rage at his most trusted advisor, accusing the man of conspiring with Lady Seraphine. The advisor had protested, confused and terrified. Lord Corvus had him dragged away for interrogation. 1 crack became 2. 2 became 4. She moved through the citadel like poison through veins, leaving chaos in her wake. A forged letter here, suggesting Lady Seraphine had been meeting secretly with werewolf emissaries. A planted document there, showing Elder Marcellus had been corresponding with Eddie's enemies about regime change. None of it was true. All of it was believed, because the thorn veil had weakened their ability to sense deception, and paranoia had made them eager to see betrayal everywhere. In the servant passages, Melissa heard everything. Lord Corvus convinced his guards were compromised. Lady Seraphine sleeping with silver chains around her door. Elder Marcellus requesting permission to return to the High Council until the current instability resolves, a diplomatic way of saying he no longer trusted his own safety in Eddie's court. And Eddie, who had ruled with unshakable authority for 400 years, was beginning to fracture. She heard it in his voice during council meetings, the way it had lost its smooth certainty. She saw it in the way he stood on his balcony at night, no longer a solitary figure of power, but something smaller, more hunted. He'd stopped sleeping in his chambers, rotating between rooms to avoid patterns. He'd dismissed half his guards, certain they were compromised, then reinstated them when paranoia suggested the remaining half were worse. The white lilies helped. She left them everywhere now, in his study, his chambers, places only he should be able to access. Each one a reminder that she could reach him whenever she wanted. That walls and guards meant nothing. That he was prey now and she was patient. The Elder's envoy arrived on the 43rd day of Melissa's campaign. She watched from a servant's alcove as the delegation entered the throne room, 5 ancient vampires in ceremonial robes, their faces carved from centuries of watching kingdoms rise and fall. They did not bow, did not show deference. This was an audit, not a courtesy call. Eddie received them from his throne, but even from her hidden vantage point, Melissa could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the armrests just slightly too tight. The High Council, the lead elder announced, her voice resonating through the hall, has received concerning reports. A broken treaty. A poisoned elder. Evidence of internal corruption and incompetence. We are here to determine whether Eddie Vesper remains capable of holding his territory. The word hung in the air like a blade. Capable. The question every immortal feared once they'd ruled long enough. Had they grown weak? Complacent? Vulnerable? Eddie's amber eyes swept the throne room, landing on each member of his fractured council. Lord Corvus, who flinched at the attention. Lady Seraphine, who met his gaze with barely concealed calculation. Elder Marcellus, who looked away entirely. No allies left. No trust. No certainty. I am investigating the matter personally, Eddie said, and Melissa heard the crack in his voice. Small, barely there, but present. The traitor will be found. See that they are, the elder replied. The High Council does not tolerate weakness. Resolve this, or we will resolve it for you. The delegation swept out, leaving devastation in their wake. In the servant passage, Melissa smiled. Don't skip. Hit like, subscribe, and comment your location plus favorite moment so far. Let's see how far this story has reached. She pulled out her journal and wrote in precise script, Day 43. The elders question his capability. The court tears itself apart. The king fears shadows. Next phase, orchestrate the coup. Let them destroy each other. She closed the journal and melted back into the darkness, a queen in her kingdom of forgotten spaces, conducting a symphony of destruction one careful note at a time. Chapter 7. Eddie stopped sleeping entirely. Not because vampires required it, they didn't, but because the few hours he'd allowed himself had become battlegrounds of paranoia and phantom sounds. Footsteps in empty corridors. The rustle of fabric behind closed doors. The scent of herbs that shouldn't exist in the Citadel's stone and blood atmosphere. Instead, he worked. Obsessively. Methodically. Hunting the ghost that was destroying him. His private study had transformed into something that mirrored Melissa's own workroom, though he didn't know it. Maps covered every wall, connecting incidents with red thread. The treaty collapse linked to the blood merchant's death, linked to the elders' poisoning, linked to the forged documents. Each disaster meticulously documented, searched for patterns, connections, the signature of a single architect. The profile emerged slowly, assembled from fragments like a shattered mirror. Someone with intimate knowledge of court protocol, 40 years of it, minimum, to understand the subtle differences between genuine documents and forgeries. Someone with access to seals, either current or historical. Someone with expertise in compounds, poisons, blood alchemy. Someone with motivation for revenge, wronged recently enough to act, but patiently enough to plan for months. And someone who is already dismissed as irrelevant. Invisible. Beneath notice. Eddie pulled out the execution records, a ledger he hadn't consulted in decades because he delegated such minor administrative matters to Lord Corvus years ago. He flipped through pages of names, rebels, traitors, thieves, political inconveniences. The list was longer than he'd expected. 400 years of absolute power left a considerable trail of bodies. Thomas Whitmore. Age 23. Executed for treason, day 247 of the current year. Charged by Lord Corvus. Minimal investigation. Sentence carried out publicly. Eddie stared at the name, memory crystallizing. The young man in chains. The protests of innocence. The old woman in the crowd who'd collapsed but hadn't cried. The old woman who'd stood in his throne room 3 days later and promised his destruction. The old woman whose eyes had been cold, ancient, utterly certain. He pulled another ledger, personnel records, going back centuries. Found her easily, Melissa Whitmore. Master herbalist, Royal Court. 37 years of service. Retired 6 years ago. Expertise, blood tonics, poison identification, compound synthesis. Notes, meticulous record keeper. Maintained extensive personal journals. Access to seals, yes. She'd worked directly with the Bloodstock Authority, the trade wardens, the diplomatic corps. Motivation, her grandson, executed for a crime he likely didn't commit. Eddie's hands tightened on the ledger until the ancient paper cracked. No. Impossible. She was mortal, elderly, her hands gnarled with age. She'd been dismissed, forgotten, irrelevant. He'd laughed at her threat because the idea of her destroying him was absurd. But the evidence didn't lie. The white lilies were her signature. He'd found mentions of them in the old court physician's notes, how Melissa always left them for those she'd tended in their final moments. The herbalist's knowledge required for Thornvale, for the Elder's compound, for the subtle poisons that made vampires vulnerable, exactly her expertise. The meticulous planning, the patience, the intimate understanding of every crack in his power structure, 37 years of silent observation. It was her. Had been her from the beginning. A mortal woman, 71 years old, had been systematically destroying a vampire empire for 3 months, and he'd been searching for traitors among immortals while she operated from shadows he'd forgotten existed. Eddie descended into the archives that night, leaving his fractured court behind. The ancient library beneath the citadel held centuries of documentation, treaties, correspondences, records of everything that had ever mattered to his reign. He needed to understand her, to find the pattern, the flaw, the moment of vulnerability she would inevitably show. She was mortal, human, limited by flesh and time. She would make a mistake. He pulled volume after volume, searching for references to her work, her methods, anything that might reveal how to stop her. Above him, the court was tearing itself apart. Lord Corvus had arrested 3 of his own guards for suspected conspiracy. Lady Seraphine had barricaded herself in her quarters, refusing all visitors. Elder Marcellus had formally requested permission to leave for the High Council's seat, a request Eddie couldn't deny without confirming the elder's suspicions of instability. His kingdom was crumbling. His alliances were broken. His reputation was ashes. And somewhere in the forgotten spaces of his own fortress, the woman he dismissed as powerless was orchestrating it all. Eddie found himself at a window as false dawn approached, staring out at the mortal quarter where her empty cottage stood. He'd posted guards there, had it searched 3 times, found nothing. She was a ghost. An invisible force. A nightmare wearing the face of a grieving grandmother. He touched the white lily in his pocket, the one from his pillow 2 nights ago, and felt something he'd thought himself incapable of after 4 centuries. Respect. And beneath it, far more dangerous, the cold certainty that he'd underestimated her so catastrophically that there might be no recovery. In the servant tunnels below, Melissa prepared the final pieces of her masterwork. The coup would begin tomorrow night. And Eddie, isolated and paranoid and brilliant, would be too late to stop it. Chapter 8. The truth settled over Eddie like a burial shroud. He sat in the archives surrounded by decades of Melissa's meticulous documentation, each page a testament to her brilliance. Her journals on blood alchemy were works of genius, observations that had taken him centuries to understand, she'd catalogued in mortal years. Her notes on vampire physiology contained insights that even the Elder's physicians hadn't considered. Her records of court protocol were so detailed they could serve as instruction manuals for how to dismantle everything he'd built. And the white lilies. There, in the old court physician's log from 43 years ago, Melissa Whitmore possesses an unusual custom. She leaves a white lily at the bedside of every patient in their final hours, regardless of their station. When asked, she said it was to remind them that even death deserves beauty. Eddie's hands trembled as he read it. Every lily she'd left him was a death marker, a promise that his final hours were approaching, that she was tending him now as she'd tended dying patients, with methodical care and the patience to see them through to the end. He'd been a dead man walking for 3 months, and he'd only just realized it. The full scope of his defeat crystallized with terrible clarity. The Treaty of Iron Shadows, irreversibly broken, the werewolves would never trust him again. His blood supply, permanently compromised, even replacing the merchant wouldn't restore confidence. His inner circle, shattered by paranoia he'd helped cultivate through his own investigations. Elder Thaddeus's poisoning, a stain on his reputation that would follow him through centuries. The High Council's visit hadn't been a warning. It had been a eulogy. He'd become exactly what Melissa intended, a cautionary tale. The ancient king who'd grown so arrogant in his power that he'd laughed at a mortal grandmother's threat and paid for it with everything he'd spent 400 years building. The archives contained one more crucial document, a personal note in the old physician's hand, written 30 years ago, Melissa asked to view the execution protocols today. Said she wanted to understand them, in case she was ever called to tend the condemned in their final moments. I showed her the procedures, the timing, the public announcement system. She took notes with her usual thoroughness. Eddie closed his eyes. She'd been planning this for decades. Long before Thomas's execution, she'd understood exactly how his court functioned, how to manipulate it, how to destroy it. The execution had simply given her the motivation to activate knowledge she'd been accumulating for 37 years. He was outmatched. Completely, catastrophically outmatched by an enemy he dismissed as beneath notice. But he was still a king. Still immortal. Still capable of one final move. Don't skip. Hit like, subscribe, and comment your location plus favorite moments so far. Let's see how far this story has reached. If she wanted him to understand loss, then she would need to see him lose something that mattered. Something public. Something that would draw her out of her shadows because her sense of justice, that rigid, mortal sense of justice that had motivated this entire campaign, wouldn't allow her to watch an innocent die. Eddie emerged from the archives as dawn approached, his mind sharp with desperate clarity. He called Lord Corvus to his study, ignoring the man's paranoid flinching. "Announce an execution," Eddie commanded. "Tomorrow night. Public. The prisoner is Sarah Winters, arrested for harboring information about the traitor." Corvus's confusion was evident. "Your Majesty, there is no Sarah Winters in custody." "I know." Eddie's amber eyes were cold, calculating. "Create her. Have the guards bring someone from the mortal quarter, anyone, it doesn't matter. Present her as a co-conspirator who knows the identity of the one destroying us. Announce that she will be given the chance to confess publicly before execution." Understanding flickered across Corvus's face. "You're setting a trap." "The herbalist has shown herself capable of extraordinary patience," Eddie said quietly. "But she's still mortal. Still bound by mortal weakness, conscience, compassion, the inability to watch injustice without acting. She'll come. And when she does, we'll be ready." Corvus bowed and hurried out to make arrangements. Eddie stood alone in his study, staring at the white lily he'd kept. The trap was desperate, obvious, the kind of crude stratagem that proved how far he'd fallen. The architect who'd moved through his court like a surgeon now reduced to blunt instruments. But it was all he had left. He placed the lily in a vase on his desk and spoke to the empty room, knowing somehow that she could hear him, that her network of passages carried sound to her forgotten kingdom. "I know who you are, Melissa Whitmore. I know what I took from you. I know what you've taken from me." His voice was soft, respectful, no trace of the laughter that had started this. "Tomorrow night, we end this. You've made your point. You've educated me. Now come finish what you started." In the tunnels below, Melissa heard every word. She smiled, patient and cold, and began preparing for the final confrontation. Eddie's trap was perfectly constructed for someone else. But she'd been 10 steps ahead since the beginning. Chapter 9. The throne room was packed for the execution, though not with the usual bored courtiers. Tonight, tension crackled through the air like lightning before a storm. Every vampire present could sense it. Something was coming, something final. Eddie sat on his obsidian throne, watching the prisoner being led forward. The woman, a random mortal servant, terrified and confused, stumbled in her chains. His trap was set. Guards lined every entrance. Lord Corvus stood at his right hand, vigilant and paranoid. Then the doors exploded inward. Not with force, but with chaos. Lord Corvus's own guards were fighting each other in the outer chamber, screams and accusations echoing through the stone halls. "Traitor! You're working with the rebels." The carefully orchestrated paranoia that Melissa had been cultivating for months reached its fever pitch. And through the chaos walked Melissa. She entered slowly, without guards restraining her, without fear marking her bent frame. She wore the same black widow's dress, her gray hair pulled back, her gnarled hands folded before her. Every vampire in the throne room froze, sensing something ancient and terrible in the way she moved, not with immortal grace, but with the absolute certainty of someone who'd already won. "You set a trap," Melissa said, her rough voice carrying clearly. "How thoughtful. But I'm not here to save your prisoner, Your Majesty. I'm here because it's time to show you what you've become." Eddie stood, his hand moving to his sword. "Seize." "Lord Corvus won't help you," Melissa interrupted calmly. "He's currently discovering that his most trusted allies are attempting a coup. Evidence of their conspiracy, meticulously forged, I should add, is being found in their quarters as we speak. He'll be executing half your remaining inner circle by morning." Horror flickered across Corvus's face as shouts from the outer chamber confirmed her words. His guards were dragging nobles from their positions, brandishing documents, screaming about treason. "Lady Seraphine," Melissa continued, turning slightly, "is about to receive an anonymous message that Elder Marcellus has been plotting with the High Council to replace Eddie. She'll accuse him publicly within the hour. He'll defend himself. They'll tear each other apart." Lady Seraphine's face went white. Elder Marcellus stood abruptly, confusion and fear warring on his ancient features. "I orchestrated the coup," Melissa said simply. "Spent 3 months planting suggestions, forged evidence, manipulating every paranoid whisper. And I also ensured it would fail spectacularly, exposing everyone involved. Your court will complete its own destruction without me lifting another finger." Eddie's voice was raw. "Why reveal yourself? Why come here?" "Because you needed to see it." Melissa's eyes, those cold, ancient eyes, fixed on him with terrible clarity. "You needed to understand that the wretched widow you laughed at dismantled 400 years of power in 3 months. The Treaty of Iron Shadows? I destroyed it with a forged letter. Your blood supply? I poisoned it with compounds you couldn't detect. Elder Thaddeus? I made him convulse on your floor to prove your private reserve wasn't safe. The white lilies? Death markers, Your Majesty. I've been tending you the way I tend all dying patients." She stepped closer, and Eddie couldn't move, paralyzed by the sheer weight of her revelation. The blood merchant, the forged documents, the paranoia, every disaster, every crack, every moment of fear, that was me. One mortal woman with nothing but knowledge, patience, and grief. The throne room was silent except for the sounds of violence from the outer chambers. "Kill me," Eddie said hoarsely. "End this." "No." Melissa's smile was cold. "Death is mercy. Death is sleep. You don't get sleep, Eddie. You get to live. You get to rule over the ruins of everything you built. You get to watch your court destroy itself, your reputation crumble, your name become a cautionary tale whispered by elders for centuries. You get to fear every shadow, every white lily, every moment of peace, because now you'll always wonder if I'm coming back to finish what I started. What do you want?" His voice broke. "My throne? My confession? Penance. I want you to remember Thomas," Melissa said quietly. "Not as a name in a ledger, but as a boy who died because you couldn't be bothered to care. I want you to feel what I feel, powerless, broken, watching everything you love die while the powerful laugh." She turned toward the door. "That's my revenge. Not your death. Your eternity." "The elders," Eddie began desperately, "are currently reviewing my documentation," Melissa said. 3 months of evidence showing how one mortal woman destroyed your empire. They're terrified, Your Majesty. Some have already sent envoys offering me positions, protection, power." Her laugh was bitter. "As if I wanted power. I wanted justice. And, failing that, I wanted you to understand what you are." She reached the threshold and paused. "You're a cautionary tale now, Eddie. The king who laughed at a grandmother's threat and paid for it with everything. Live with that. Live with the fear. Live with knowing that the wretched widow is out there, and you'll never know if she's truly finished." Melissa walked out into the night, leaving behind a throne room in chaos and a king in ruins. Behind her, Eddie collapsed onto his throne, surrounded by the sounds of his court tearing itself apart, and felt the white lily's ghost wait in his pocket. She'd won. Completely. eternally. And he would spend the rest of his immortal life haunted by her laughter, the one she'd never given him, but that echoed in his mind louder than his own ever had in hers.